They ignored you. They pulled away when you gave your all. They made you feel like you were too much, too emotional, too available, too real. But now
Now they're watching you.
they're thinking about you. Now they want you. Why? Because the one thing an avoidant fears the most is the one thing they secretly crave the deepest.
Connection.
And when they lose someone who gave it unconditionally, it doesn't fade, it haunts them. Avoidants have a pattern that confuses almost everyone who experiences it. At first, everything feels intense, magnetic, even promising. They show interest, curiosity, sometimes even deep connection, but the moment things start to shift from surface-level attraction into emotional depth, something changes. They pull back, become distant, harder to read, and sometimes completely unavailable. And if you're on the receiving end, it's easy to take that personally. You start asking yourself what you did wrong, what you said, or why you suddenly weren't enough. But the truth is far less about your worth and far more about what's happening inside them. What they're really reacting to is vulnerability, real emotional exposure. When a relationship begins to require openness, consistency, and emotional responsibility, it triggers discomfort in someone with avoidant tendencies. Not because those things are bad, but because they challenge the way that person has learned to protect themselves. For many avoidants, closeness has historically been tied to pain, loss of independence, or emotional overwhelm. So instead of leaning in, they instinctively lean out. It's not a calculated decision, it's a deeply ingrained response. When you, as someone capable of deeper emotional connection, begin to show care, attention, and authenticity, it creates a kind of mirror. It reflects what real intimacy looks like, and that can feel confronting. Because to meet you at that level, they would have to lower their guard, express their feelings, and risk being seen. Bully. And for them, that level of exposure feels unsafe. So instead of stepping forward, they step back. This is where the misunderstanding becomes painful. From your perspective, you're offering something genuine. You're being present, emotionally available, and invested. But from their perspective, that same energy can feel overwhelming. It's not that your emotions are too much, it's that they haven't built the capacity to hold that kind of emotional space. So rather than admitting that, they create distance. Sometimes it looks like losing interest. Sometimes it comes across as coldness or indifference. But underneath it, there's often confusion and internal conflict. They may even like you a lot. That's what makes this dynamic so frustrating. They can feel drawn to you, enjoy your presence, and still pull away at the exact moment things start to deepen. It creates a push-pull dynamic that leaves you trying harder, giving more, and questioning yourself. But the more you try to close the gap, the more they feel the pressure, and the cycle continues. It's important to understand that their withdrawal is not a reflection of your value. It's a reflection of their emotional limits at that moment. They are reacting to the discomfort of intimacy, not evaluating your worth as a person. But because they often don't communicate this clearly, their behavior sends a completely different message. It feels like rejection. It feels like abandonment. And over time, it can make you doubt your own instincts. The reality is, emotional availability requires a level of self-awareness and inner security that avoidants are often still developing. Until they confront those patterns, they will continue to associate closeness with discomfort and distance with relief. And that relief reinforces the behavior. Pulling away feels safer than staying and dealing with the vulnerability. So when someone like that distances themselves, it doesn't mean you were too much. It means you were real. You brought something authentic to the table, something that required them to show up in a way they weren't ready for. And instead of rising to meet it, they retreated to what felt familiar and safe. Understanding this doesn't make the experience painless, but it does shift the narrative. Instead of internalizing their withdrawal as a personal failure, you begin to see it as a limitation in their emotional readiness. And that awareness is powerful because it allows you to stop chasing clarity from someone who can't provide it and start recognizing the difference between someone who is incapable of meeting you where you are and someone who simply doesn't want to. When you're consistently present in someone's life, especially as an empath, you can become invisible to them. Not because it lacks value, but because it becomes familiar. You show up, you listen, you understand, you give without constantly asking for something in return. Over time, that steady emotional presence starts to feel like the baseline rather than something rare. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, familiarity often reduces urgency. They assume you'll be there. They assume the connection will remain available. So they don't fully engage with it and they don't recognize its depth while they still have access to it. This is where the dynamic quietly shifts. While you're investing emotionally, they're maintaining distance. While you're building connection, they're keeping one foot out the door. Not necessarily because they don't care, but because they don't feel the risk of losing you. Your consistency, which should be valued, ends up being taken for granted. And when something is taken for granted, it's rarely appreciated in real time. But absence changes perception in a powerful way. The moment you're no longer there when your messages stop, your attention disappears, your emotional energy is withdrawn, it creates a gap. And that gap forces awareness. Suddenly, the space you used to fill becomes noticeable. The conversations that felt effortless are gone. The understanding they didn't have to ask for is no longer available. And that's when something clicks. They begin to compare. Not consciously at first, but through experience. They interact with others and realize that not everyone listens the way you did. Not everyone shows patience, emotional depth, or genuine care. What once felt normal now stands out as rare. And this is the moment your value starts to rise in their mind, not because you changed, but because your absence revealed what your presence had been providing all along. Memory also plays a role here. When you're no longer in their daily life, they don't replay every detail, they replay the emotional highlights. The way you made them feel understood. The way you created a sense of safety without pressure. The way you connected on a level that didn't require explanation. Those moments become amplified over time, especially when they're contrasted with more surface-level interactions elsewhere. For someone with avoidant patterns, distance also removes pressure. When you were close, your emotional availability may have felt overwhelming to them. It required engagement, vulnerability, and consistency, things they weren't fully comfortable with. But once you're gone, that pressure disappears. And without that pressure, they can finally feel what they suppressed before. They can miss you without the responsibility of showing up. They can desire the connection without having to immediately face the vulnerability it requires. This is why the empath often becomes more valuable after they leave. Not because they suddenly became better, but because the environment changed. The constant access is gone. The emotional safety you provided is no longer something they can rely on. And that absence forces them to confront what they lost, often in a delayed and confusing way. However, it's important to understand that this realization doesn't always lead to growth or change. Sometimes it simply creates longing. They may think about you, miss certain aspects of the connection, even feel drawn to you again, but still not have the capacity to engage differently. The awareness of your value doesn't automatically mean they've developed the emotional tools to sustain a healthy relationship. For you, this dynamic can feel bittersweet. On one hand, there's a sense of validation in knowing that your presence mattered more than they showed at the time. On the other hand, it can be frustrating to realize that your value was only fully recognized once you were no longer available. It raises questions about timing, readiness, and whether things could have been different if they had seen it sooner. But the deeper truth is this: your value didn't increase when you left. It was always there. The difference is that your absence created the conditions for it to be seen. And that distinction matters because it keeps you from tying your worth to someone else's delayed realization. It reminds you that what you bring to a connection of empathy, depth, consistency is not something that needs to be proven through loss to be real. When someone only begins to recognize your worth after you're gone, it says more about their awareness than it does about your value. And while they may come to see you as irreplaceable, the real question becomes whether they've grown enough to meet you in a way that aligns with what you deserve. There's a paradox at the heart of attraction that becomes especially intense with avoidant personalities. The more available something is, the less urgency they feel toward it, and the less available it becomes, the more their attention sharpens. This isn't about playing games or manipulation, it's about how their internal wiring responds to emotional pressure and space. When someone is consistently present, expressive, and pursuing connection, it can unintentionally create a sense of emotional demand. For an avoidant, that demand feels heavy. It signals expectation, closeness, and the possibility of losing independence. So instead of moving closer, they create distance to regulate that pressure. When you're the one reaching out, initiating, and keeping the connection alive, you may believe you're strengthening the bond. But from their perspective, it can feel like there's no room to breathe, no space to come toward you on their own terms. The more you lean in, the more they lean out. Not because they don't feel anything, but because the intensity of closeness activates their instinct to protect themselves. Distance for them feels like control. It feels like safety. Everything shifts when you stop chasing. When you pull your energy back not as a tactic, but as a genuine decision to reclaim your focus, you remove the pressure that was driving them away. The constant reminders of emotional expectation disappear. The space that once felt crowded now feels open. And in that openness, something unexpected happens. They start to feel their own desire again. Without the pressure of needing to respond, commit, or match your level of emotional investment, you can choose to take a break and recharge. They can finally experience the connection from a place of freedom. And freedom is where their attraction lives. It's where curiosity comes back. It's where they begin to wonder about you, think about you, and even miss you. The same person who seemed distant when you were close can suddenly become attentive when you step away. Not because they've changed overnight, but because the dynamic has shifted. Distance introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty creates intrigue. When you're no longer predictable, no longer always available, always responsive, always giving, they can't rely on the same patterns. They don't know what you're doing, how you're feeling, or whether you're still emotionally invested. That lack of certainty pulls their attention toward you. It disrupts the comfort they had in knowing you would always be there, and it replaces it with curiosity. At the same time, your absence allows them to process their feelings without being overwhelmed by them. When you were present, your emotional availability may have required them to respond in ways they weren't prepared for. But in your absence, they can reflect without pressure. They can revisit memories, recognize the connection, and feel the emotional impact at a pace that feels manageable to them. And often, that leads to a delayed sense of desire. For you, this can feel confusing, even frustrating. You gave your energy when you were present, and it didn't seem to be fully received. But when you step back, suddenly there's interest, attention, or even pursuit. It can make you question whether distance is the only way to be valued, or whether connection always requires withdrawal to be felt. But the deeper reality is that this dynamic is specific to someone who struggles with sustained closeness. Healthy attraction doesn't rely on absence to stay alive. It grows through mutual effort, emotional safety, and consistent engagement. But for someone who associates closeness with pressure, distance becomes the only environment where their feelings can surface without fear. That's why your withdrawal appears to create desire. It doesn't actually create it. It reveals what was already there, but suppressed. The key difference is that when you're no longer chasing, you're no longer abandoning yourself in the process. You're no longer overextending to maintain a connection that isn't being met equally. You're allowing space not just for them to feel, but for you to regain clarity. And in that clarity, you begin to see the dynamic more objectively. You recognize that attraction built on distance is unstable if it can't exist alongside closeness. So while distance may bring their desire to the surface, it also gives you the perspective to decide whether that desire is enough, whether it's consistent, whether it's supported by action. Because real connection isn't just about being wanted when you're gone, it's about being valued when you're present. Control is one of the quiet forces shaping how avoidants experience attraction, even if they're not consciously aware of it. When they feel in control of a connection, when they know you're available, responsive, and emotionally invested, it creates a sense of stability for them. But that same stability can dull their sense of excitement. There's no uncertainty, no risk, no need to step outside their comfort zone. They can engage on their terms, pull back when they feel overwhelmed, and return when it feels safe. In that position, the connection becomes predictable, and predictability for them often feels less compelling than it should. When you're consistently there, offering your time, your attention, and your emotional presence, it unintentionally reinforces that sense of control. They don't have to question where they stand with you. They don't have to wonder if you're pulling away or losing interest. And while that might sound like a healthy foundation, for someone who is used to managing closeness by controlling distance, It removes the very tension that fuels their attraction. The dynamic becomes one-sided in a subtle way. You're investing and they're regulating. But the moment the dynamic shifts, when you stop overextending, when you no longer center your energy around them, when you begin to reclaim your independence, the balance of control changes. Suddenly, they're no longer certain. The person they could rely on for emotional consistency is no longer as accessible. The patterns they were comfortable with begin to break. And that loss of control creates a new emotional response, heightened attention. Uncertainty has a powerful effect on perception. When something is no longer predictable, it becomes more noticeable. Your absence, your reduced availability, or even your emotional detachment introduces questions they didn't have to ask before. What are you doing? Are you still interested? Have you moved on? These questions pull their focus toward you in a way that consistent availability never did. And with that focus comes a renewed sense of desire, not necessarily grounded in deeper understanding, but driven by the shift in dynamic. At the same time, your independence changes how they see you. When you're no longer orienting your actions around them, you begin to appear more self-contained, more grounded, more in control of your own life. That energy is different. It doesn't seek validation, it doesn't wait for approval. It simply exists. And that can be both intriguing and unsettling for someone who was used to having a more predictable influence on the connection. You're no longer fitting into the role they understood, and that unpredictability makes you stand out. There's also an emotional contrast that begins to form. When you were consistently available, your presence may have blended into their routine. But once that presence is removed or reduced, it creates a gap that highlights what's missing. They begin to feel the absence of your attention, your understanding, your emotional support. And because they no longer have control over when or how they receive it, that absence carries more weight. It's no longer something they can access at will, it becomes something they have to face without. This shift can easily be mistaken for deeper emotional awakening, but it's important to look at what's actually driving it. In many cases, the increased attention or attraction isn't coming from a sudden development of emotional readiness. It's coming from the disruption of control. The connection feels different because the balance has changed, not necessarily because their capacity for closeness has grown. And without that growth, the same patterns can repeat if the dynamic returns to what it was before. For you, this is where awareness becomes essential. It's easy to interpret their renewed interest as a sign that things are finally aligning, that they're ready to show up differently. But if that interest is rooted primarily in the loss of control, rather than a genuine shift in how they engage with vulnerability, it may not sustain itself in a healthy way. The attraction might be real, but the foundation behind it hasn't necessarily changed. What matters most is recognizing the difference between being desired because you're no longer predictable and being valued because of who you are. One is driven by uncertainty and imbalance, the other is built on mutual respect and emotional consistency. When you step into your own independence, you're not just changing how they see you, you're also changing how you see the connection. You're no longer trying to maintain control or earn their attention. You're observing, evaluating, and deciding what aligns with you. And that shift is where your real power lies. Not in becoming unattainable for the sake of attracting them, but in becoming grounded enough that you no longer need to be controlled or to control the outcome. There comes a point where something shifts inside you, not because they changed, but because you did. You stop overanalyzing their behavior. You stop waiting for their messages. You stop rearranging your emotional world to accommodate their distance. And without making a dramatic announcement, you begin to pull your energy back and invest it into yourself. That shift might look quiet from the outside, but internally it's powerful. It's the moment you start choosing self-respect over emotional chasing. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this change doesn't go unnoticed, even if they don't immediately acknowledge it. They were used to a certain version of you, the one who was consistently available, emotionally responsive, and willing to meet them wherever they were, even when it wasn't enough. That version of you created a kind of emotional safety for them, not because it was balanced, but because it was predictable. They knew how the dynamic worked. They knew you would show up. But when you begin to heal, that predictability fades. You're no longer reacting in the same ways. You're no longer reaching out first every time, no longer trying to fix the distance, no longer seeking reassurance from someone who couldn't consistently give it. And that change creates a kind of disruption in their internal world. The dynamic they understood is no longer there, and they don't immediately know how to interpret it. Your healing becomes a mirror. It reflects a level of emotional growth, self-awareness, and inner stability that they haven't fully developed themselves. And that reflection can be uncomfortable. It highlights the gap between where you are and where they are. While you're becoming more grounded, more secure, and more clear about your needs, they're still navigating the same patterns of avoidance and emotional protection. That contrast can trigger a mix of reactions: curiosity, confusion, even a sense of loss. At the same time, your detachment removes the emotional pressure they once felt. When you were more invested, your presence may have required them to respond, to engage, to step into a level of closeness they weren't ready for. But now, with that pressure gone, they have the space to feel without being overwhelmed. And in that space, emotions that were previously suppressed can start to surface. They might begin to think about you more, reflect on the connection, and recognize aspects of it they didn't fully appreciate before. There's also a shift in how they perceive your value. When you're no longer seeking their validation, your energy changes. You come across as more self-contained, more independent, more aligned with yourself. That kind of presence is different from someone who is trying to hold on to a connection. It doesn't ask for attention, it naturally draws it. And for someone who is used to distancing themselves from emotional intensity, that grounded energy can feel both safe and intriguing at the same time. However, this is where it's important to stay clear about what's actually happening. Their renewed interest or attention isn't necessarily a sign that they've resolved their patterns. It can be a reaction to the change in you rather than a transformation within them. They may feel drawn to your growth, but that doesn't automatically mean they can meet you at that level. Attraction to your healing is not the same as alignment with it. For you, this phase can be confusing. You've done the work to step back, to reconnect with yourself, to move forward, and now there's a shift in their behavior. They may reach out, show more interest, or seem more emotionally available than before. It can create a sense of possibility, a question of whether things could be different this time. But it's important to look beyond the surface of that attention and ask whether the underlying patterns have actually changed. Your healing wasn't meant to bring them back, it was meant to bring you back to yourself. It was about reclaiming your time, your energy, and your emotional clarity. And while it may have an impact on how they see you, its real purpose is to change how you see the situation. You're no longer operating from a place of need or operating from a place of choice. That distinction matters because it gives you the ability to observe without immediately reacting. You can notice their behavior without being pulled back into old patterns. You can recognize the difference between temporary attention and consistent effort. And you can decide from a place of stability whether what they're offering aligns with what you've grown into. In the end, your growth doesn't just change the dynamic, it changes the standard. And once your standard shifts, it becomes much harder to settle for anything that doesn't meet it. There's a moment in this journey that feels almost ironic. Just when their attention starts to return, just when they begin to show signs of interest, curiosity, or even emotional openness, that's often the exact point where something inside you has already changed. The version of you that once waited, hoped, and tried to make sense of their distance is no longer in the same place. You've grown. You've reflected. You've started to understand not just them, but yourself. And that understanding quietly shifts your priorities. At first, the idea of them coming back might have felt like the resolution you wanted. It seemed like validation, like proof that what you shared mattered. But as you evolve, that desire begins to lose its intensity. Not because your feelings were fake, but because your perspective has expanded. You start to see the connection more clearly, both the depth it had and the imbalance it carried. You recognize how much of yourself you were giving, how often you were trying to bridge a gap that wasn't yours to close alone. Growth brings clarity, and clarity changes what you're willing to accept. You begin to understand that connection isn't just about chemistry or emotional intensity. It's about consistency, mutual effort, and the ability to meet each other in the same emotional space. Without those elements, even the strongest attraction can become exhausting. And once you've experienced that exhaustion, it becomes harder to romanticize it. So when they reappear, when they reach out, show interest, or attempt to reconnect, it doesn't land the same way it once would have. There's a pause, a kind of internal check. You're no longer reacting from a place of longing, you're observing from a place of awareness. You're asking different questions now. Not do they want me, but can they meet me where I am? Not how do I make this work, but is this aligned with what I've learned I deserve? This shift can feel unfamiliar at first. There might still be a part of you that remembers the connection, that feels the pull of what once was. But alongside that feeling is a new sense: grounding. You're no longer willing to ignore red flags or minimize your needs just to keep the connection alive. You've seen what happens when you do that, and you're not interested in repeating the same cycle. What's important here is that your focus is no longer on changing them or waiting for them to become someone different. You understand that real change has to come from within, and it can't be rushed or forced by someone else's expectations. If they've done the work, it will show in how they communicate, how they show up, and how they handle closeness. If they haven't, no amount of hope or effort on your part will fill that gap. This is where the idea of outgrowing becomes real. It's not about seeing yourself as better than them or dismissing what you shared. It's about recognizing that you've moved into a different phase one where your needs, your boundaries, and your emotional awareness have evolved. And sometimes that evolution creates a distance that can't be closed, simply by revisiting the past. Outgrowing someone can feel bittersweet. There may be gratitude for what the connection taught you, along with a quiet acceptance that it no longer fits who you are now. You're not closing the door out of anger or resentment, but out of self-respect. You're choosing not to step back into a dynamic that required you to shrink, overgive, or constantly question your place. At the same time, this phase brings a different kind of confidence. You're no longer dependent on someone else's recognition to feel secure in your worth. You don't need them to come back to prove that you mattered. You already understand that you did, and that understanding frees you from the need to chase, convince, or wait. The real power isn't in making them realize what they lost. It's in reaching a point where their realization, whether it comes or not, doesn't define your direction. You're no longer trying to be chosen, you're choosing. You're choosing connections that feel balanced, mutual, and aligned with the person you've become.
And that's the shift that changes everything.
Because once you've experienced that level of self-awareness, it becomes the new baseline. You don't go back to hoping someone will meet you halfway, you move forward with the expectation that they already can.